Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, and especially thank you for remembering my dear colleague and our friend Igor Zabel, who died in Ljubljana 8 years ago. Igor was one of the pioneers of the discussion on the questions we are dealing here today, and somehow it seems it's always a pleasure and a pain to talk about him, but whenever we come to those issues, it's impossible not to think about how he would react, what he would say. I edited a book of essays of his texts, which came out a year ago, and actually when during the presentation I was always repeating that we shouldn't treat his texts like a monument, like just to remember some period and some man, however important he was, but as useful material for our research in the future, for our confronting with questions on the global and local, regional, or each level we are confronting in our everyday life and work. Igor Zabel approached large and demanding specialist tasks as well as complex art and current cultural concepts with specific humor. Those who knew Igor Zabel would know what I'm talking about. And in very playful manner, often with an ironic distance and critical skepticism. He was very serious and precise, but he was always appearing like not too serious. I would say that he looked upon his own work in the light of almost all of the Eastern European scenes as shown and synthesized in the exhibition 7 Scenes, which took place in Moderna Galleria Ljubljana in 2004. And I have to apologize, my presentation is actually without presentation because my computer was stolen yesterday, just before I left the museum. So, yeah, I'm really sorry. But so, in a way, it will sound and look like Igor's presentation because he preferred not to present images. Actually, his favorite way was, to write by hand on a train ticket or somewhere on most unusual places, and then to reconstruct his brilliant essays out of it. So these Eastern European scenes he was referring to are collectivism, utopism, masochism, cynicism, laziness, unprofessionalism, and love of the West. For example, unprofessionalism was, according to Igor, quite crucial. He was always repeating that we shouldn't, like art professionals, shouldn't love our jobs. We should hate it, at least a little bit. Because if your profession is pure love, then it's not profession anymore, then it's more like a hobby or something you work for, for your heart. And that each real professional has to hate his job at least from time to time, or think about changing it or moving somewhere else. It seems that with his way of working, he gave the best example of what he defined as important in his texts. It means critical, even often ironic and playful reactions to all of the contradictions in the ideological, social, and cultural discourses that surrounded us. The analysis and reflection of his everyday circumstances coincided with his research on the broader and more complex structures that defined these intimate and banal marginal experiences, these ephemeral, charming events. In his everyday work, he saw the profession of the curator predominantly as intellectual pleasure and as an opportunity to foster an art discourse and theoretical studies based on the deconstruction of the traditional art history logic of linear development that is built upon an a priori value system, arrogant confidence, ignorance, and simplification of terms. In Igor Zabel's expanded understanding of art, the recognition that the subject's position cannot be presented as a relation between consistency and the focus of the artwork and the context that would remain outside of it as a frame of or a background was of key importance. Most of his texts are dedicated to geopolitical issues, like we used to say. The dialogue between the former West and East, by the way, former West is Igor's term, he invented it, and their perception of the other in the context of the complex relations that followed the fall of the Berlin Wall. Another important theme covers the issues of the art system, the strategies of exhibiting, the roles of the curator, and the institutional frame of art production. But actually, even if he was writing about strictly, let's say, white cube issues, he was always aware of his position coming from specific region, specific country with all the context which comes with it. Let me present some of his crucial theses on these issues. I will quote. It seemed then, and to a certain extent still seems today, that the West, then in this case means in 2000, when Manifesta took place in Ljubljana, and today means 2004, when Igor was writing this. The title of the text is Haven't We Had Enough, referring to a famous discussion about should we continue presenting Eastern European art in such a way or not. So it seems then, and to a certain extent still seems today, and I would add that to a certain extent still seems today, that the West has the unique ability to produce just art while all other parts of the world produce culturally specific types of art. Representatives of marginalized communities are often confronted with this dilemma and frustrated by it. There is no art as such, since art is always produced, distributed, and consumed in particular circumstances. These circumstances are not only an outer framework that does not touch the essence. They determine not only the choice of the materials, subject, ideas, and issues, but also the meaning of the work. Not only its means and sources, but also its availability, distribution, and conditions of reception. It is clear, therefore, that even if we speak about art that is just art, we have to speak about its particular context and conditions, as well as those conditions that determine it as just art. One of the most basic facts of post-war Europe was the political division and balance of the two superpowers and their political, economic, and cultural systems. Even in today's Europe, the division is felt as a trauma that demands endless repetitions and reenactments. If contemporary research points to the fact that the divisions of the Cold War period were more complex than it seems, for example, that the parceling out of Europe and the rest of the world between the United States and Soviet Union was based on an agreement that both sides, in spite of occasional crises, basically respected and which kept the situation balanced, it nevertheless confirms that the division was very radical and that there has been very little communication or exchange, economic or cultural, between the two sides. We could say that the cultural power of the West was and is based on the fact that it promoted its own dominant artistic languages as normal art, which means established it as the norm of art, as just art. For those excluded from it, it became not only a norm, but also the space of desire. Only after the breakdown of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, when the structures and approaches derived from socialist realism lost their actual political function, did it become possible to perceive it differently and to allow even the possibility to think about it as art. The long dominant structure of cultural division, according to which art produced in the West became normal art, while artistic production characteristic of the East remained an ideological threat to genuine artistic expression, kitsch, or at least a cultural phenomenon, has been challenged. This does not mean, however, that the strategies of division, inclusion, and exclusion have been eliminated. To a great extent, they have been replaced by an idea of an essential cultural difference. In such a system, the non-Western artistic production becomes an expression of alien cultural identity. It becomes ethnic and exotic. And here, Isabel was actually referring to a quotation from Orhan Pamuk's novel, where he indicates this difference, this ethnicization and exotization. I here end this long series of quotations. When discussing phenomena and trends of art in 20th century, from Impressionism and social realism to conceptual art and contemporary practices, Igor Zabel disputed the narrow definitions and borders of art and always asked himself how any individual term should be understood first. He thought everything out precisely before he attempted to deal with the canonically defined modernistic traditions. For example, in most cases, he discovered that a certain art term is applied to a more complex part of culture. For example, the discovery of the Russian avant-garde in the West that indicated that the relation between avant-garde art and politics in the Soviet Union was actually more complex than it seemed before. And he ascertained that individual practices can be divided from each other. This is why some of the best works of art often move away from the established principles and dominant patterns of belonging to a sort of intermediary field. A possible and rather far-reaching consequence of these explorations could be a changed understanding of the concept of modernity. Politically, socially, and culturally, Eastern Europe was one of the most radical realizations of the modern zeitgeist. Therefore, we should perhaps start to think about modernity as something internally split and heterogeneous, not to mention essentially contradictory. I continue with Igor's quote. This also means that the changes of the dividing lines and strategies and transformations in the social and political structure in the Eastern European or post-communist countries opens the possibility of reconstructing this particular identity. Again, I should mention here the idea of a particular Eastern European cultural essence that has supposedly been the basis and the source of art that comes from the region. This is in fact a reformulation of the strategies of inclusion and exclusion and therefore domination developed after the political dualism of the Cold War lost its importance. Based on this idea, Eastern European and other non-Western cultures have been ethnicized and exoticized. Artists from such cultures have been admitted into the Western dominant cultural space as representatives of a particular strange culture. This hierarchical difference implicit in this division is not unlike the separation between artworks and cultural artifacts. Such works, of course, often arouse interest and admiration for their particular wisdom, emotional intensity, or picturesque nature, but they are not universal. For example, they demand special knowledge about their original cultural context to be enjoyed at all. Western art, on the other hand, declares itself as one of a number of different cultural productions that exist today, but through its dominant position in the global world, it still remains universal, normal. End of quotation. Igor Zabel was aware that in a world that has experienced a deep social, economic, and political transformation and was defined by the processes of integration as well as differentiation, there was a need for a new definition of the position of art and other fields linked to these changes. At the same time, he patiently explained what these re-evaluations really meant and why were they necessary. In short, we could summarize, in order to disable the establishment and preservation of the dominant model of control over cultural production, the model that is based on processing art tradition into mythology and national constituting unambiguity, on excluding and marginalizing all phony art approaches, on ideologizing culture and isolation of the national space. His professional work in the international context, which also strongly marked the tactical starting points of the activities of the Moderna Galleria from early 90s on, and almost the entire cultural space of the region, also emerged from his critical awareness. I quote, "The possibility of an author, institution, or cultural space establishing itself as a more or less relevant factor in the international world of art is based on the fact that they can respond to the events in this world from their own unique standpoint. Of course, this is not an appearance in an ethnologically characteristic costume, but a standpoint that can enable a new view in the international network or a new perspective on it." End of quotation. This view was, of course, critical towards the systems of differentiation and exclusion, new divisions and strategies of the strong Western countries in preserving their dominant position in the global culture, and especially towards the growing role of multinational global capital, new structures of nobility, and their exploitation of critical art. When cooperating internationally, Igor Zabel systematically and with great affection took into account the possibility of the productive exploitation of those multi-layered and complex conditions and circumstances of his operation that were traditionally understood as an obstacle. Honestly, and sometimes even over naively, he enjoyed the fact that he lived in a period in which Eastern European artists in general were becoming increasingly established in the international system, and that he was also contributing to the fact that the former Yugoslav art scene was developing and becoming recognizable and seriously considered in closer connections with international artists, institutions, curators, and others who operate in this field, including the art market. He showed that the international art system was slowly and gradually changing in its interaction with local systems, and he drew attention to the idea that these unavoidable globalization processes might have a positive side. He considered critical or political art in a way that revealed the inner contradictions of the world of contemporary art and the reciprocal relation between the concepts of political and autonomous art, due to which it is impossible to consider engaged art as a single unambiguous response to the complex questions of the relations between art and society. He used to say, "These are not merely academic questions. They are very practical, real issues that must be addressed by any artist, curator, or art critic who wishes to reflect on their position and work. Anyone who wants to be sure that what they do is meaningful must confront these dilemmas and work out an answer to them, at least provisionally." End of quotation. And he continues, "In thinking about cultural difference and also about European cultural identity, we have to avoid two main traps in particular. The first is considering Western or European cultural identity as homogeneous and universal, and the second is to think about cultural essence as something unchangeable, firm, basic, and essentially separated from other cultural essences, with a dividing line that can never really be overcome. I believe that the changes in the way that social realist art is understood indicate a different model of how cultural identities and the way in which they are represented can be transformed. It indicates a possible common context through which Western and Eastern artistic traditions can be connected, although they remain separate and sometimes contradict each other. And this is a possible basis for the idea that European cultural space, of course not without political and social changes, could be transformed in such a way as to actually include such different and seemingly mutually exclusive traditions into a common context. Such changes could perhaps slowly resolve the trauma of European division that still marks our experience of so-called European identity." Through his interpretation, Igor Zabel tried to establish, so to speak, a particular artistic tradition, different but no less important from the one in the West. In such a way, he also questioned the natural and universal values promoted by modernism and introduced an artistic tradition that has been highly complex and radical in its approaches and its ideas about art, politics, and society. His work was a critical response to the idea that political division and even radical changes in the structure of society remain somehow external to the art and culture and do not affect its essence. In fact, we are confronted with a number of examples that clearly demonstrate the opposite. The changes of the dividing lines and strategies and transformations in the social and political structure in the Eastern European or so-called post-communist countries opens the possibility of reconstructing this particular identity. Again, we should mention here the idea of a particular Eastern European cultural essence that has supposedly been the basis and source of art that comes from the region. This is in fact a reformulation of the strategies of inclusion and exclusion and therefore domination developed after the political dualism of the Cold War lost its importance. Igor Zabel was aware of the gap between the Western and Eastern experience following the end of the Cold War, which was impossible to simply overcome or understand as something static. For this was a constantly changing complex relation. In critical discussions of this issue, he opposed the dominant concepts of understanding our time, Fukuyama's end of history, and Huntington's clash of civilizations. I quote, What seems more productive to me, and perhaps not totally utopian, is an attempt to reformulate European identity in a way that would connect elements of both Western and Eastern social and cultural systems into a new unity. Unavoidably, such new unity will be highly complex and heterogeneous, and not without contradictions, struggles, and conflicts. Also, such an identity would necessarily be understood as something variable and changeable, and without definite outer limits. End of quotation. From this, we can also discern Zabel's characteristic realization that no knowledge is self-sufficient, and that every thought emerges through a conversation, through a dialogue that is based on a vast number of responses. He also emphasized the importance of dialogue within the role of the curator as a selector, author of the exhibitions, interpreter, and co-creator of the exhibition context. He saw the eminently personal nature of the work of a curator for modern and contemporary art as an opportunity to deconstruct the position of power, and explained, I quote, "Speaking about deconstruction, I am not trying to say that curators can eliminate their role as the instance of power in the institutional system of the world of art, but rather that they reveal this role clearly and no longer present it as something objective or natural." End of quotation. At the same time, for a more precise understanding of this deconstruction or demystification, one has to know that, I quote, "A curator never works in a clear and neutral space. His or her activity is therefore a response to particular determining conditions. For example, as somebody coming from the area of so-called Eastern Europe, I experience how the work of artists, critics, and curators from this area is a priori caught in a specific system of assumptions of cultural difference and so on, and how we are often expected to represent a particular identity and so on. It therefore seems almost unavoidable to reflect these ideas and to build an effective strategy to deal with them." End of quotation. However, the limitations of such strategy are soon revealed. Next quotation. "The critic and interpreter can be aware of their particularities. They can try to include this into their work strategy. However, the following will remain an illusion. The point from which we observe and speak will never become transparent, and we will not be able to unconditionally understand the social role of our own behavior, especially in light of the historic development of society." On the end of quotation. On the other hand, he saw the spatial and cultural definitions of this visible field captured in the institutional and production machinery of the art system, as well as restrictions and necessities in general, as an opportunity and an advantage to be approached with constructive irony, and my sort of mock staging a sort of social artistic mythologization of his own position within the art system. And I will end this with one more quotation. "Individual as well as national identities are internally heterogeneous and often contradictory, fluid and changeable, in a constant process of being established." He liked to emphasize. Thank you very much. Now, it would be probably strange to answer questions in a manner that, how would Igor Zabel think about your questions? But I think I have answered to Yara's previous question where the West ends. Igor would probably say that it ends there where the Balkans starts, and which means there are different theories. For example, in Croatia, they think it starts on the border with Bosnia. In Slovenia, they think Balkan starts on the border with Croatia. In Austria, they think Balkan starts with the border with Slovenia. And Igor liked to say that it starts in Vienna Südbahnhof. But since Vienna Südbahnhof is under construction at the moment, probably we need a new definition, new point of departure from the west. Thank you. Yeah.
I have one question.
Can I follow that up? Because in many conversations with Igor, he came up with expressions such as someone coming from so-called Eastern Europe. But I never heard him theorize the position of the former Yugoslav art space. And yet it was so distinctive. And I wonder exactly how he would have responded to this question of what that space might consist of and where it was located between East and West.
Actually, I think for this, I use the term formal Yugoslav space. Whatever, it's mine. It's not quotation. So. Definitely, he was somehow he felt responsible for this whole 6 or today even 8 countries which appeared on this territory of former Yugoslav Federation. Yeah, that's for sure. Otherwise, yeah, like being at home there, you know.
You seem to identify more comfortably with the Balkans and then East or Central Europe. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Dag Solhjell, Norway, still. What was exactly the point of view of Igor Zabel on the role of the curator? Because he describes, according to you, the artwork as a system of power, and the person holding the greatest power is the curator. But the curator should go forward and accept his subjectivity. And so to say, does the curator then say, I have no power? Is it a kind of masquerade? Okay.
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, he was trying to be as transparent as possible, you know, not to pretend that the position of the curator is neutral, is invisible, is something, you know. He was aware that it's one of the crucial parts of the art, so-called art system together with market, artists, schools, conferences, criticism, publications, magazines, and so on. That's one, and it corresponds very well with this another theory that there is no art as such. There's no neutral art and not neutral curatorial position or view. That we are always operating within certain context and structure.
All art is curated. Is that what you say?
Sorry?
All art is curated.
All art is curated, and especially when it seems that it's not curated, then it's even more curated. That was his idea, because it's, you know, he used to work in specific context. Actually, with his name and probably of name of his director, Zdenka Badovinac was one of the first. Their names appeared for the first time as the curators in local space. Before, we operated with the term organizer of the exhibition or
Of course.
writer of the text in the catalog, but not as a curator. So he maybe sometimes over performed this position in order to make it acceptable and visible and not, hidden or he was playing with this myth of strong position of the curators somehow.
So, may I continue?
He didn't want to defend this position because all these theories about curators becoming new artists, being too creative, somehow replacing artists within the art system, and especially these turbo curators with the status of stars of popular icons. Actually, he didn't want. It was, of course, it was completely strange. This position was completely strange to him, but he didn't want to defend this position and say, "Oh no, we are not powerful at all. We just love art, and this is our great passion." No, he somehow wanted to be a bit more stronger and more radical. But yeah, I think that's the historical moment, which is maybe from today's perspective hard to reconstruct. Yeah.
Laszlo Becker again. I will be more simple. I was quite friendly with Igor. I met him several times. And there is another issue, is the Westbahnhof. Because it goes the other way through Hungary to Transylvania. That's what the problem of the Hungarians in Romania. They have to choose always if Romania, and this means Balkan, or Hungary means West. One aspect. The second one, Davor Maticevic, also died, and an excellent curator in Zagreb. When we, in about 80, we prepared from Hungary a kind of Eastern European manifesto, he told, "Excuse me, we are South-Ost." And he didn't agree at all about this Eastern European concept. Southeast for Zagreb, okay. If you understand me.
What do you think? What is the main message of his work? Because he was now he was very influential critic. You can try only one sentence.
My favorite sentence is that we shouldn't, act in the costume of national. How it's that entering the global scene without insisting on some bizarre local identities, and so trying not to avoid being manipulated by another manipulation.
Thank you.